I smelled the smoke 3 miles out. Coming back from the feed store, the wind shifted and I caught it. Burning straw turned earth. I turned onto my access road and stopped telling myself it was brush. The HOA's contracted burn crew was already on my north field. Orange vests, hose line along the fence. The far corner of my wheat, 60 acres I'd spent 7 months growing, was on fire, not smoldering, on fire. An orange notice was stapled to my fence post. I hadn't put it there. A woman stepped directly in front of me before I reached the gate. Mid-50s, lanyard, clipboard. She didn't greet me. "We're executing an emergency fire hazard abatement under community safety protocol," she said. "You are not to interfere. On my land. If you attempt to stop the crew, we'll have you removed from the area." Removed from my own property. I looked at her the way you look at someone who has badly miscalculated. Then I pulled out my phone and photographed the notice on my fence post. She watched me do that. She didn't flinch. Violation notice 2247, fire hazard abatement required, community buffer zone violation, fine $750 per day, retroactive to original notice date, non-compliance, lien on parcel, cited authority, community buffer zone ordinance. I read that last part twice. Her name was Karen Whitfield, HOA board president, Creekside Commons. She had a security contractor standing behind her with a radio, and 2 crew members photographing my fence line like they were documenting a hazard site. My fence line, my field. 40 years of my family's farming on this land. She held out a printed sheet toward me. Clean header. Itemized. Emergency abatement services. $3,400. She expected me to take it. I didn't. "Fines are accruing at $750 per day," she continued. "Retroactive to the original notice date. A lien will be placed on this parcel until all outstanding fees are satisfied." I looked at the notice again. Community Buffer Zone Ordinance. I'd spent 4 decades working agricultural land in this county. I'd read more zoning filings and county codes than most people see in a lifetime. I had never heard of that ordinance. I would later find out why. It had never been filed with any county office, any city agency, or any state board. Karen had typed those words, printed them on official-looking paper, and called it law. Then she said the thing that told me exactly who I was dealing with. "This entire parcel falls within our community buffer zone. The HOA has full authority to act on safety hazards adjacent to residential properties. That's not up for debate." Settled law, that's how she said it. Like a woman who had said it before and watched people fold. Behind her, the burn line had pushed another 30 yards into my field. The crew worked like this was routine. One of them stamped his clipboard, "Abatement in progress." The wheat was gold and heavy. It was my family's livelihood. And it was burning while a woman with a lanyard explained to me what authority she had over my land. I took out my phone and dialed the county non-emergency line. Filed a report for unauthorized entry on agricultural property, right there, in front of Karen and her crew. She said, "That's your prerogative." Not concerned, not even slightly. I put my phone away and looked north. Past the crew, past the white smoke rising thick against the morning sky, past my north fence line, to the rise of land where my grandfather's levee sat. He'd built that structure in the early 70s. The county had deeded it to our family as part of an agricultural water management grant in 1974. I'd maintained it every season since I took over this land. Driven past it every morning of my working life without thinking of it as anything other than infrastructure. Standing there watching my wheat burn, I thought about it differently. She was standing on the edge of my field telling me she had authority over land my family had worked since before her HOA was incorporated. What she didn't understand, what none of them on that board had ever thought to check, was that I owned something else, something upstream, and it was a lot bigger than a wheat field. I took the invoice from the air between us, folded it once, put it in my jacket pocket. "I'll need your full authorization documentation," I said. "Every document you relied on to enter this property and conduct this burn." Karen smiled. "Our attorneys will be in touch." By sundown, 60 acres were ash. I drove home with the fire marshal's case number in my phone, the $3,400 invoice in my pocket, and a photograph of violation notice number 22247 on my fence post. I set all of it on the kitchen table, sat down, looked at it for a while. Then I went to the back room and opened my safe for the first time in 2 years. What Karen Whitfield had never thought to check, what the entire HOA board had never once looked at, was the water rights deed sitting inside that safe, the one with my name on it, the one that controlled every drop of water that flowed through this valley, including the reservoir sitting directly behind their country club. My grandfather built this farm from hard ground in the 1950s. He spent 20 years turning rock-hard clay into decent wheat country. When the state's agricultural water management program opened in the early 1970s, he applied, qualified, and used the grant to build the levee himself, poured concrete, hired 2 hands, worked summers on it while my father was still in school. The county deeded the water rights to our family in 1974. My father took over the operation in 1981. I took it from him in 1998. For 30 years after that, we had good neighbors, a cattle ranch to the east, a retired couple who grew fruit trees to the west, open land in most directions, and the kind of quiet that comes from people who understand that working land requires leaving it alone. Then, 12 years ago, a regional developer bought the acreage to the south. They cleared the scrub oak in about 6 months. After that came the grading, the streetlights, the cul-de-sacs, the HOA signage, Creekside Commons, 96 homes, gated entry, brick paver medians, a neighborhood newsletter. 2 years after the homes went up, they built the country club and golf course on the low end of the property, on the elevation that sat naturally beside the reservoir my grandfather's levee fed. They needed water access. Their landscape architect had designed the golf course around it. So before construction began, the developer contacted my father and arranged a water rights usage license, a legal agreement authorizing the country club to draw from the reservoir our levee supplied. My father signed it. Standard agricultural water management arrangement. A few years later, I inherited that license along with everything else. Nobody from the HOA ever introduced themselves. No knock at the door, no letter of introduction. The development appeared, filled up, and began its suburban life without anyone on their side apparently noticing that the quiet farmland to their north had a name on a deed that wasn't theirs. That was fine. I didn't need to be known. I needed to grow wheat. Karen Whitfield became HOA president 5 years after the community opened. I barely noticed at first. She sent a letter to every homeowner about lawn height in her first month, a second letter about approved exterior paint colors in her second. By her third month, she'd added a weekend compliance inspection schedule. Homeowners I'd occasionally wave to from the road started keeping their heads down, rushing in and out, looking like people waiting for a ticket they knew was coming. She ran her community like a system under audit, and systems under audit look for violations at their edges. Within 2 years of taking that board seat, she looked past her own boundary line and started at mine. The first notice arrived about 2.5 years before the burn. HOA letterhead. It informed me that my wheat field fell within the Creekside Commons community buffer zone and required aesthetic compliance review. She cited something called the Community Buffer Ordinance. I handed it to my county land use attorney the next morning. She called me back by end of day. My parcel was agricultural zoned and explicitly exempt from HOA enforcement under state law. That much was settled. More directly, the Community Buffer Ordinance Karen had cited didn't exist anywhere in the county code, any municipal filing, or any state ordinance database. The HOA's own founding CC&Rs, on file at the county recorder's office, made no provision for enforcement against adjacent non-member agricultural land. The boundary lines were clear, had been clear since the development was platted and recorded. My attorney sent a formal response, certified mail, signature required, Karen signed for it. She never replied. 3 months later, I received another letter making the same claim with slightly different wording. That told me everything I needed to understand about how she operated. She didn't accept no from people she'd assessed as unable to push back. She'd reassert, reframe, wait for exhaustion to set in, and most people she'd found would eventually comply just to make the letters stop. She'd read enough of her neighbors correctly that it had become a reflex. She hadn't run the same calculation on me yet. What Karen had never thought to do, what the entire HOA board had apparently never done, was read the water rights license their country club operated under. Not the summary, the actual document, specifically a clause that had been in there since my father signed it in 1974. It said this: if the licensor suffered property damage caused by any party operating within the licensed zone, the license was immediately void. All water rights would revert exclusively to the licensor. Their golf course, their fountain, their manicured fairways, their reservoir views, all of it sat on a license with that clause buried inside it, recorded with the county, binding, and sitting exactly where my father's attorney had placed it 50 years ago. Nobody on that board had ever read it. I hadn't thought about it in years. But 12 months later, standing in front of a burn crew working through my wheat, it was all I could think about. 3 weeks before Karen burned my field, she sent me a new notice. Different from the buffer zone letters, this one had a dollar amount on it. The HOA's formal violation notice cited my wheat crop as a fire hazard to adjacent residential properties. Fines of $750 per day would begin accruing in 14 days unless the field was cleared to community safety standards. The notice did not define what cleared meant. It did not cite a statute. It listed no specific code, no county regulation, no state ordinance that supported the fire hazard designation. Just the HOA's letterhead, a deadline, and a number. I took it to my attorney that afternoon. She drafted a formal response within 48 hours. It was thorough. It cited the state agricultural zoning exemption by name and statute number. It referenced the Farming Rights Protection Act that explicitly prohibits HOA enforcement action against adjacent non-member agricultural properties. It noted, precisely with the filing date, that my parcel did not appear anywhere in the HOA's recorded CC&Rs as subject to their jurisdiction. Every legal basis Karen had claimed to have was addressed and refuted, paragraph by paragraph, in plain language. We sent it certified mail to Karen Whitfield, board president, Creekside Commons HOA. She signed for it on a Thursday morning. She called me that Friday afternoon. I let it ring once, then I hit the button on my recording app before I answered. I'd started keeping that habit after the second buffer zone letter. Mr. Harlan, she said, not a question, not a greeting, just my name used as a kind of announcement. I'm calling regarding your attorney's correspondence. Go ahead, I said. The exemptions your attorney cited are not applicable to emergency safety ordinances. The HOA holds a separate community safety mandate that supersedes standard agricultural zoning classifications in matters of public risk. I waited a moment. Can you send me the filing number for that mandate? Our legal team will be providing documentation in due course. I'd like to see it before the fine deadline. The deadline stands, Mr. Harlan. I'd encourage you to take this seriously. She hung up. I saved the recording, labeled it with the date, and added it to a folder I'd started on my desktop. Attorney correspondence, certified mail receipts, call logs, every notice she'd sent me going back 2 years. I didn't know exactly what shape the folder would eventually take. I knew I wasn't going to stop adding to it. The board meeting was the following Tuesday. I decided to attend. Creekside Commons held their monthly meetings in the country club's main hall, the same building that would be underwater 6 weeks later, though I didn't know that yet. The room was maybe 40 homeowners in folding chairs, Karen and 4 board members behind a table at the front, an agenda projected on the wall. I sat in the back and waited until the open comment period. When they called it, I walked to the microphone. I was calm. I want to be clear about that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a speech. I asked Karen Whitfield one question. Can you cite the specific county ordinance or state statute that grants this HOA authority to enforce fire safety standards on non-HOA agricultural land? The room went quieter than it had been before. 40 people who'd spent years receiving compliance notices from this woman watched her face. She looked at me for a moment. Then, the board will consult with our legal counsel and follow up with all appropriate documentation. I've asked that question in writing twice, I said. I'm asking it on the record now. She called a recess. I went home. No follow-up came. Not that week, not the week after. What came instead arrived 2 days after the board meeting. A second violation notice. Same letterhead. Different numbers. Fines retroactively increased to $1,500 per day, effective from the original notice date. A property lien was now threatened pending legal review of non-compliance. No new citation, no new basis, not a single new legal argument, just a bigger number and a more serious threat. My attorney called it what it was when I forwarded it to her. Retaliatory escalation with no legal grounding. The HOA had no mechanism, none, to enforce a lien against a non-member agricultural parcel outside their jurisdiction. The threat was a pressure tactic. They were betting I'd do the math and decide compliance was cheaper than the fight. They weren't wrong that it's a bet that usually pays off. Most people look at a lien threat and a $1,500 daily fine and start calculating what it would cost to just make it stop. Karen had run that bet enough times to trust it. I looked at the notice. I looked at my folder. I labeled a new section, Escalation Post-Board Meeting. Noted the date, the fine amount, the lien language, the absence of any new legal basis, added it to the stack. Then I opened a second folder, started a separate file. HOA board meeting, my attendance, open comment, Karen's non-answer, date confirmed. That was on record now. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night, looking out the north window. The wheat was coming in well that season. Clean, heavy heads, good yield if the weather held. I didn't know at the time that they'd already made their decision. And they had no idea I'd already made mine. After the board meeting, I started paying closer attention to a pattern I'd been dimly aware of for a while. My neighbors to the east were a retired couple, Tom and Marilyn Fitch. They'd had a vegetable garden and a storage shed on their back parcel for as long as I could remember. In the past year alone, they'd received 3 HOA compliance notices, paint color on the shed, a garden bed supposedly encroaching on something called a community sightline corridor, failure to submit exterior modification request forms for fence posts they'd replaced after a storm. They'd paid all 3 fines without question. It hadn't occurred to them that they could do otherwise. To my west was Dorothy Crane, 74 years old, fixed income. She'd lived in a small house on the edge of what had once been her family's orchard since before Creekside Commons existed. She'd been receiving HOA notices for 3 years, Similar language to mine. Similar vague authority claims. Similar absence of any cited statute. She paid everyone. By the time I sat across from her at her kitchen table, she had sent Karen Whitfield's HOA a total of $12,000. I showed Dorothy the exemption letter my attorney had prepared, the one that said her property, like mine, had never been subject to HOA jurisdiction, that the fines she'd been paying had no legal basis, that she had never been required to comply. She read it slowly, set it down on the table, looked at it for a long moment. "They told me I had to," she said. "I didn't know I could say no. I thought about that on the drive home." $12,000 from a woman on a fixed income extracted through official-looking letterhead and the kind of authority that most people don't think to question. No statute behind it. No legal foundation, just confidence in paper and the assumption that nobody would look closely enough to call it what it was. I went to the county recorder's office the next morning. I pulled the original plat map filed when Creekside Commons was approved and recorded. It took the clerk about 20 minutes to locate it. When I spread it on the table in the records room and found my parcel, the boundary line was exactly what I expected. Clear, notated, and unambiguous. A demarcation between the HOA's recorded territory and my agricultural land, drawn on the day the development plan was filed. My parcel sat outside that line. It had always sat outside that line. The phrase community buffer zone did not appear on any page, in any annotation, anywhere on the plat. I photographed every relevant section. Then I requested a copy of the HOA's founding CC&Rs, the document that defined what Creekside Commons HOA actually was, what it had authority to enforce and against whom. I read it that afternoon at the kitchen table, every page, no provision for agricultural land, no provision for adjacent non-member properties, not one clause, not one sentence, not one word that extended the board's authority beyond the community's own recorded boundary line. Karen's community buffer zone ordinance had no existence in the founding documents of her own organization. She had invented it, put it on letterhead, sent it to people as though it were law. While I was at the recorder's office, I made one more request. County-held audio recordings of HOA board meetings from 2 to 3 years prior, the period when the development had first started pushing against adjacent land boundaries. What I found took a few days to obtain. When I finally listened to it, I understood immediately why Karen had removed it from the published minutes. 3 years earlier, at a regular monthly board meeting, a board member had raised the adjacency question directly. The recording captured him saying, "The parcel to the north is agricultural zoned. It's not in our CC&Rs. We don't have authority there." There was a brief discussion. Karen said, "We'll address that through our community safety framework." The exchange ended. The published minutes for that meeting contained no reference to any of it. Not paraphrased, not summarized, gone. But the county had the audio. Counties keep their recordings. Nobody had thought to check. I labeled it and added it to the folder. That evening, I did what I'd been putting off for a week. I went to the back room and opened my safe. My grandfather's original county water rights grant from 1974, the transfer documentation to my father, the transfer to me in 1998. Behind those, a folder my father had filed and rarely talked about, the water rights usage license signed with the developer at the time the country club was constructed. I'd read it once, years ago, when I inherited the operation. I hadn't touched it since. I read it now. The license covered the reservoir access, the draw rights, the flow allocations the golf course depended on. Standard language through most of it. Then near the end, one paragraph, plain wording. If the licensor suffers property damage caused by any party operating within the licensed zone, this license is immediately void and all water rights revert exclusively to the licensor. I read it again. I set the deed on the table. I sat there looking at it for a while, not deciding anything, not making any plans, just thinking about the fact that this clause existed, that it had always existed, and that nobody on that HOA board had apparently ever thought to read the document their country club's water supply depended on. I took out a notepad and wrote one line. Then I put the deed back in the folder, closed the safe, and went to bed. The call came at 10:47 in the morning. 9 days after the second violation notice arrived, before my attorney's response deadline, I was pulling out of the feed store parking lot when my phone rang. Tom Fitch, my neighbor to the east. His voice was careful. "There's smoke coming from your north field," he said. "Thick smoke." I drove the 9 miles back in 8 minutes. Tom's warning had not done the scene justice. Half my north field was already gone. The HOA's contracted crew, orange vests, hose line along my south fence, were working their way back toward the access road, methodically, like they had a schedule. One man photographed the damage with a clipboard and stamped it while I was still getting out of my truck. Abatement complete. Karen Whitfield was standing near her car at the edge of my property. Not on the road. On my land. She looked the way people look when a plan has gone exactly right. "Mr. Harlan," she walked toward me. Everything was executed according to community safety protocol. You'll receive the abatement completion report within 5 business days. She held out a printed invoice. I took it. Emergency abatement services, $3,400. I looked at my field, 60 acres of wheat. At current commodity prices, approximately $54,000 of standing harvest, not counting seed costs, equipment hours, or the 7 months of work that had gone into getting it there. She was handing me a bill for $3,400 and calling it service. I'll need your full authorization documentation, I said. Every document you relied on to enter this property and conduct this burn. Our attorneys will provide whatever the standard process requires. She smiled the way someone smiles when they've run this play before, and it always ends the same way. I pulled out my phone, called the county non-emergency line, filed a criminal property destruction report. 60 acres of agricultural crop, unauthorized entry, referred to the county fire marshal's office, right there, 10 feet from the crew that had burned my field. I gave them the address, the estimated crop value, the name of the organization responsible. When I hung up, Karen laughed. Small, controlled. That's absolutely you're right, she said. Behind her, one of the board members shifted his weight and looked at the ground. He didn't say anything. I photographed everything. The field, the invoice, the crew, the clipboard stamped, abatement complete, the orange notice still on my fence post, Karen standing on my property. Then I got in my truck and drove home. I didn't call anyone for a while. I sat at the kitchen table and looked out the north window at the smoke still rising. Then I went to the back room and opened the safe. Water rights deed, the usage license. I'd read the void clause twice already. Now I read it a third time. If the licensor suffers property damage caused by any party operating within the licensed zone, this license is immediately void and all water rights revert exclusively to the licensor. I set the license down. The licensed zone was defined in the agreement as the property area subject to the water flow managed by my levee system, my parcel. The land Karen's burn crew had spent 4 hours working on that morning. Her crew, my property damage, documented, photographed, and stamped by the crew's own clipboard. The clause didn't ask about intent, didn't require a court finding. It required one condition: property damage caused by any party operating within the licensed zone. That condition had been met at 10:47 this morning. I didn't act on it. Not yet. I needed to be sure I was reading it as written and not as I wanted it to read. I waited 3 days. Then I called Patricia Okafor, water rights specialist. I'd retained her twice in 40 years. Precise, methodical, and she did not tell clients what they wanted to hear. I walked her through the deed, the license, the void clause, and Karen's burn. Told her about the invoice, the crew on my property, the damage report filed with the county. Then I asked her one question. If a licensed party's contracted crew enters the licensed zone and causes property damage to the licensor, is the license void? She was quiet for a moment. Then, send me the documents tonight. I drove to her office the next morning. She read everything in front of me, asked 2 clarifying questions, made notes, said she'd call within 48 hours. She called in 36. I would learn weeks later, through the civil subpoena process, that the night before the burn, a board member had texted Karen directly. Are we sure about this? The paperwork isn't finalized. Karen had replied with 2 words, do it. That exchange would eventually matter a great deal to a number of people in ways Karen hadn't planned for. But I didn't know any of that yet when Patricia called. She said yes. And the morning after that, I drove to the north end of my property, to the levee, for the first time in 2 years. The burn happened on a Wednesday. The monthly HOA board meeting was the following Tuesday. I decided to be there. I arrived early and took a seat in the back row of the country club's main hall. 40-odd homeowners in folding chairs. Karen and 4 board members behind the table at the front, a projector, an agenda, bottled water, the kind of room that looks very official until you remember it's run by people whose actual authority ends at their own property line. Karen opened with the burn. The board successfully executed an emergency abatement of the agricultural fire hazard adjacent to our community last Wednesday, she said. She used the word successfully the way people use it when they want to make a decision sound finished. This was a significant action, and I want the community to understand that the board took every appropriate step to protect your homes and your property values. A portion of the room applauded. Not all of it, but enough. 5 years of compliance notices had trained a significant number of these homeowners to understand the wheat field as a problem, not a farm. Karen had been building that consensus carefully, and it showed. She moved to the next item without pausing. The board is also initiating a formal petition to the county for a permanent agricultural buffer ordinance. This would establish a minimum distance requirement between crop cultivation and residential properties within our community envelope. She advanced the slide. A map appeared on the projection screen. My parcel was shaded. This will ensure the situation cannot repeat itself. She was trying to zone me off my own land, permanently. Through a county petition process she had apparently already drafted, I wrote the date in my notebook and underlined it. Then the door at the back of the hall opened. A woman in a county windbreaker walked in and approached the board table. She spoke quietly to the board secretary, who leaned over and said something to Karen. Karen looked up. "Excuse me," the woman said, addressing the room with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivers formal notifications for a living. "I'm with the county fire marshal's office. I have a brief statement for the board." The room went still in the particular way rooms go still when something unscheduled interrupts something very scheduled. "The fire marshal's office has opened a formal investigation into the burn event of last Wednesday, involving the agricultural parcel adjacent to this community. The Board of Creekside Commons HOA has been identified as the responsible party. Board members will receive written notification within 3 business days." She set an envelope on the table in front of Karen, nodded once, walked out. The room stayed quiet. Karen's expression held for 3 seconds, then she said, "We welcome any review. We acted entirely within our community safety mandate." Her voice was the same. Her eyes were not. 2 board members on her left did not look up from their notebooks. I watched her face very carefully. I watched which board members looked at each other. I noted it. The meeting continued. Karen moved through the remaining agenda items with the forward momentum of someone who has decided not to acknowledge a development. Garbage pickup schedule. Exterior paint compliance timeline. Fountain maintenance budget. I did not say anything. I was not there to say anything. Afterward, in the parking lot, under the amber glow of the country club's tasteful entrance lighting, a man in a gray suit approached Karen and handed her a document. "My attorney's process server." He said 2 words, her name and "for you," and walked back to his car before she'd fully registered what was in her hand. Civil complaint, crop destruction, unauthorized entry on agricultural property, estimated damages, $54,000 plus legal fees and costs. Karen looked at it for a moment, then looked up at the small cluster of homeowners still standing nearby. "This," she said, holding it up, "is exactly the kind of frivolous harassment the board warned you about from difficult non-member property owners. We will respond appropriately." Several people nodded. Several others had already turned toward their cars. I was standing about 30 feet away. She didn't look in my direction. 3 people approached me before I reached my truck, not together, separately with the careful distance of people who don't want to be seen having a particular conversation. First was a man I recognized from the eastern section of the development. He'd paid compliance fines twice in the past year. "I didn't know it wasn't legal," he said quietly. She always sounded so certain. Second was a woman who'd lived in the community since it opened. She asked if my attorney was taking other cases. Third was a man who said nothing at all, just handed me a folded piece of paper with his phone number on it and walked away. I gave each of them my attorney's contact card, told them to call. Then I drove home. It was Tuesday night. Patricia Okafor had confirmed my legal standing 2 days earlier. The documentation was complete. The fire marshal's investigation was open. The civil complaint was served. Karen was holding a legal process she hadn't expected and performing confidence about it in a parking lot for an audience that was, for the first time, not entirely buying it. Everything was in order. I set my notebook on the kitchen table, made a cup of coffee I didn't finish, went to bed earlier than usual. The next morning I didn't call anyone. I didn't send a letter. I didn't warn them. I just drove north and I opened the gate. The Levee gate is a steel structure my grandfather installed in 1971, hand-welded, county-inspected, deeded to our family along with everything else. I arrived at 6 in the morning. I walked the berm the way I'd walked it 100 times before. The gate mechanism was in good condition. I serviced it every spring. I set my phone on the fence post, camera running. I laid the water rights deed and the usage license on the hood of my truck, open to the void clause page, photographed both. Then I called Patricia. "I'm at the Levee," I said. "I want to confirm one final time before I touch anything." "Your agricultural irrigation redirect is within the terms of the deed," she said. "The license is void. The water rights are yours to manage as the deed specifies. You are legally clear, Mr. Harlan." "Thank you, Patricia. I'll be monitoring my phone." I hung up, put the deed back in my jacket pocket, walked to the gate mechanism. Then I opened it. Water moves the way water always moves, quietly at first, then with the weight of everything behind it. The reservoir had been sitting at normal seasonal capacity, 3 months of spring runoff and a wet April. It found the gradient it had always known, south-southeast, downhill, through the natural drainage corridor the developer's landscape architect had built the golf course alongside when they designed Creekside Commons Country Club 12 years ago. I watched the flow begin for a few minutes, then I got in my truck and drove home. I made breakfast, read the paper, waited. By 10 o'clock, my phone started ringing. I let the first two calls go to voicemail. The third was County Dispatch. Mr. Harlan, we're receiving reports of flooding at Creekside Commons. Are you aware of any changes to water flow from your levee system? Yes, I said. I performed an agricultural irrigation redirect this morning. I can provide full documentation. By the time I drove back out at noon, the lower elevation of the country club was under 6 inches of water. The 7th, 8th, and 9th holes of the golf course were gone. The stone fountain at the main entrance was submerged. The brass Creekside Commons sign that marked the club driveway stood in a foot of moving water. The manicured hedges along the entry walk were flooded to their bases. Patricia arrived 20 minutes after I did. She walked the county inspector through the water rights deed, the agricultural irrigation permit, and the void clause. 1 page, 1 paragraph, 1 condition met. The licenser suffered property damage caused by a party operating within the licensed zone, she said. Under the terms of the license, the water rights revert fully to Mr. Harlan. This is a documented legal agricultural water management action by the deed holder. Mr. Harlan has been in full compliance with county water management protocols throughout this process. The inspector read the deed, read the void clause, read it a second time. Then he looked at the invoice I had produced, $3,400. Emergency abatement services, Karen's signature on the authorization line, documenting exactly who had ordered the crew onto my property and what they had done while they were there. He wrote something in his notebook and didn't say anything. That was when Karen arrived. She came in fast across the wet pavement, phone at her ear, taking in the fountain, the submerged sign, the fairways, and then she found me standing by my truck. You will be arrested. Her voice was controlled, but the edges weren't. What you've done is criminal destruction of property. I am calling the county sheriff and you will be removed from this area. The county officer standing 12 feet away looked up from his copy of the deed. Ma'am, he said, no law has been broken here. Karen turned. He flooded this facility deliberately. That is vandalism. The deed holder performed a legal agricultural water management action on his own property. I've reviewed the documentation. That documentation is fabricated. It's on file with the county recorder's office, Patricia said. Filed in 1974, it has been there the entire time. Karen looked at Patricia, then at the officer, then at the inspector who was still writing, then at me. I was standing with my hands in my jacket pockets. I had nothing to add. Everything that needed saying was already in the documents. The fire marshal's criminal referral, opened the prior week, formally referenced violation notice number 2247 in its filing that afternoon. The same orange notice Karen had stapled to my fence post on the morning of the burn. The same number I'd photographed before anyone thought I was paying attention. It was now listed as Exhibit A in a criminal property destruction case. The phrase community buffer zone, the words Karen had used with complete authority while my field was on fire, appeared verbatim in the county attorney's preliminary review, cited as an example of a non-existent ordinance fabricated to justify unlawful entry on a non-member agricultural parcel. I was told later that when a county attorney read that line aloud to a colleague across the room, Karen was standing 20 feet away and said nothing. That was when the fire marshal's office received the text exchange. 2 words from Karen's phone, pulled through the civil subpoena process. Do it. Karen Whitfield and 2 board members were formally notified before sundown that they were subjects of a criminal investigation for willful destruction of agricultural property. A local news crew arrived at 4 in the afternoon. They filmed the flooded fairways, the submerged sign, the water still moving through the drainage corridor. Their segment ran that evening under the headline, Farmer Legally Redirects Water Rights After HOA Burns His Crop. Country Club Floods. I watched it from my kitchen table. They'd gotten my name right. They'd gotten the deed date right. They'd gotten the crop damage figure right. I turned off the television. On the table in front of me, the water rights deed folded back into its original crease, the $30,400 invoice beside it, and the photograph of orange violation notice number 2247 still on my fence post in the early morning light of the day. Karen Whitfield decided my wheat field was hers to burn. She had picked up a match and handed me the only thing I needed. The county prosecutor's office filed formal charges against Karen Whitfield and 2 Creekside Commons board members 6 weeks after the flood. Willful destruction of agricultural property. The fire marshal's criminal referral had been accepted in full, the same referral that cited violation notice number 2247 as its primary exhibit. The same orange notice Karen had stapled to my fence post on the morning her crew arrived with hose lines and a stamped clipboard. The HOA's civil liability was confirmed in a preliminary hearing the following month. My crop destruction claim had standing. Their attorneys attempted 3 separate arguments for dismissal. The court declined each one. The settlement came 8 weeks after that, $127,000. It covered the destroyed harvest at commodity value, seed and equipment costs, legal fees, and punitive damages under the state agricultural damage statute. Under the board's individual conduct policy, Karen Whitfield was personally liable for a portion of that figure. Every fine the HOA had levied against my parcel was voided retroactively. The full record, going back to the first buffer zone notice, cleared. The county also reviewed all fines Creekside Commons had levied against non-member adjacent properties over the prior 6 years. The majority had no legal basis. Dorothy Crane received a check for $12,000. The full amount she'd paid over 3 years on a fixed income because Karen Whitfield had sent official-looking letters and Dorothy had trusted them. The Permanent Agricultural Buffer Ordinance, the petition Karen had announced at the Tuesday meeting, the county map with my parcel shaded in gray, was withdrawn from consideration before it reached a formal hearing. 3 of the 5 HOA board members resigned within 2 weeks of the criminal charges being filed. The remaining 2 called a special election. The new board's first public act was a formal written apology addressed to me and to every adjacent property owner who had received a compliance notice without legal foundation. 2 paragraphs, signed by the full board. The country club spent several months on structural drainage remediation. The lower 3 holes were resurfaced. The entry fountain was rebuilt. The brass Creekside Commons sign at the driveway was replaced with a smaller one. Karen Whitfield did not attend another community meeting. I heard most of this secondhand, through Patricia, through my attorney, through the occasional call from the residents who'd approached me in the parking lot that Tuesday night. The man who'd handed me his phone number on a folded piece of paper called once to say the new board had waived a full year of HOA dues for all residents as part of the transition. He sounded like someone who'd been holding his breath for a very long time and had finally been told it was safe to stop. Dorothy called on a Thursday morning in late March. The check came, she said. Good, I said. $12,040. They included the processing fees. I told her I was glad, then I drove over. We sat on her porch with coffee for about an hour. She'd already called a fencing company about the back parcel. The fence that had been leaning since fall, the one she hadn't touched because she was afraid of triggering another notice. She was fixing it that weekend. We talked about her fruit trees, which were doing well, and what the spring looked like for wheat. She didn't ask about the case or the flood or any of it. Before I left, she put her hand on my arm and said, "Thank you for looking at that map." I told her anyone would have. She shook her head slightly. April came early that year, warm and wet, good seeding conditions. I turned the north field in the first week, worked it through the second, and put seed down by the third. There's something specific about seeding a field that's been burned. The soil is different, easier in some ways. The ash breaks up the clay, harder in others you don't expect. I worked through it. By the last week of April, the first green was coming up along the north fence line. Thin rows, low to the ground, the way wheat always looks before it finds its footing. My grandfather used to say that a wheat field in its first week looks like it's deciding whether the whole thing was worth the trouble. I drove north one morning before the day started, parked at the levee, walked the berm in the same early light I'd walked it 2 months before. The reservoir sat behind the gate at normal seasonal capacity. Still, the kind of quiet that belongs to land that's been left alone to do what it was always meant to do. I took the water rights deed from my jacket pocket, photographed it with the date visible on my phone screen, filed the image to the county recorder's digital record, a formality Patricia had recommended to close the loop on the water rights audit completely. Then I folded the deed back into my pocket. My fence line was clean, no orange notices, no violation numbers stapled to the posts, no invoice for services I hadn't asked for and didn't owe. The wheat was coming up green in the ash-turned soil behind me. I stood there for a while, then I got in my truck. They burned what I grew, so I used what I owned, and I'd do it the same way again.